Okay.
You know, being American, and we can build it up with that stadium entry sound if you like, the sports arena. This is going to be.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
All right, Shlomo, it's all yours.
All right. Are we live?
We're live.
Let him in.
Good.
Right, how do we let him in? There we
Just
go.
hit it all. I could do it if you want.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Let's just give them another 30 seconds. Let the people in the waiting room in. And then there you go. Great. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome the communities here in South Africa and Rabbi Shishler's community in Chabad of Strathaven, and in Cape Town community in Tableview with Rabbi Darren. And I'd like to welcome our very special guests, Rabbi Avremi Zippel from Utah, and my dear friend Nick Engel, Johannesburg, who's going to be in conversation with Rabbi Zippel on a very sensitive subject, but yet in a very open platform. And Rabbi Zippel is going to share his story. We encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, as Rabbi Zippel says, this is an open book. Feel free to put those questions forth to him or just in the chat box, and they will address those questions as we go along. So I'm handing over to Nick, who will conduct the conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shlomo, for the opportunity. Welcome, Rabbi Zippel. It's a tremendous honor for me to be able to talk with you tonight and to discuss something that's very challenging to talk about, very painful to talk about, but vitally necessary, because the more that we have the opportunity to share, the more that people who have unfortunately endured the same have an understanding that they're not alone, and again, that it was not their fault. So I just wanted to start off with running through a couple of questions with you, if that's okay. You grew up in Salt Lake City after the Rebbe of blessed memory sent your parents to Utah to serve as the Chabad Rabbi and Rebbetzin. Please tell us a little bit about your parents' work and what life was like for you growing up in a rabbi's home.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you to the various communities for your hospitality and allowing me to join you tonight, albeit by Zoom, but in South Africa. Nick, before I address the specifics of the question, I must tell you, I grew up here in the United States. I had the good fortune of attending yeshiva in England for 3 years, and I really got enthralled with the accents, the various accents, and notwithstanding the fact that I attended yeshiva in London, of all the different varieties of English with an accent, the South African accent has always had a very dear place in my heart. And so you're going to have to forgive me. There might be times tonight when I just get so caught up in the accent, I'm not even going to hear the question because, it's just the accent is so musical to my ears. But thank you all for the very warm introduction into the various communities for having me. My name is Rabbi Avremi Zippel. As Nick indicated, I have the good fortune of serving as a Chabad Rabbi in Salt Lake City, Utah, here in the United States. For most people who don't know Utah, where it is in American geography, we are located somewhere in between Chicago and Los Angeles, if that helps you kind of gain context for it a little bit in the Midwest. And as Nick said, I've had the good fortune of living here for my entire life. My parents were sent to Salt Lake City in 1992. Shortly before the Rebbe's 90th birthday, Chabad, as a movement, as an organization, decided that for the Rebbe's 90th birthday, they wanted to gift the Rebbe, as it were, the presence of Chabad in a state that did not have a full-time Chabad presence to that point. And Utah was chosen to be the state, and my parents were chosen to be the representatives. And they moved here almost next year will be 30 years. So 29 years ago this summer, they were kind enough to bring me along for the ride. They started Chabad here in Salt Lake City. And I had the tremendous opportunity to grow up in that sort of environment, like Chabad kids do now around the world, and as they did back in my day as well. And I think that for most kids, they go down a variety of paths when growing up the child of a Chabad Rabbi or Rebbetzin. Some take to it more, some take to it less. For me personally, it was something which I connected with very deeply from a very, very young age. The idea of serving a community and having that sort of responsibility, that spiritual responsibility, as it were. And it was something which I wanted to do for myself from as far back as I could remember. It was always a dream of mine, not just to serve the community in the capacity as the rabbi's son, but to come back one day and be a rabbi in my own right. And after attending yeshiva and receiving some sort of education, I had that opportunity. My wife and I got married in January of 2014. And later that year, we had the opportunity to join the team here at Chabad to work on the younger demographic here of the local community. And it's a blessing for both of us. We both grew up in that sort of home. We both were exposed to that from a very, very young age. And having the opportunity to serve a community now in our own right is something which we are deeply, deeply grateful for. Nick, I think you might still be muted.
Thank you. Again, I'm not going to share the joke I shared with you a little bit earlier. Yeah. So we've got a lot of people coming in, and I seem to be busy clicking onto them. So if my eyes do move over, please excuse me. So obviously your childhood was not a simple one. Can you tell us a little bit about the events that led us here today?
Growing up as a Chabad child in Salt Lake City was different, unique, most certainly in a number of ways. One of the most prominent factors that made it so unique is that back in the day when I was growing up, there was no Jewish day school here in Salt Lake City, which is a reality which we're very fortunate that is actually changing. In the next 3 weeks, we'll be opening Salt Lake City's first Jewish day school, but this is almost 30 years later. Back in the day, there was no Jewish day school here, and so my siblings and I were homeschooled for the entirety of our childhood. And, as we like to joke nowadays, we were doing the cool thing before it was cool. Nowadays with COVID, everyone is being homeschooled in some form or fashion, and we did it before it was popular. And I would say that not only did we do it before it was popular, but more importantly, we actually did it in the most probably authentic, hardcore way possible. And then now there's Zoom schools and, and homeschool has a number of interpretations. We were quite literally schooled at home, in the home, just with each other all day, every day. And, it was the life that we knew. I don't think that any of us suffered as a result of it. We didn't know any other sort of reality. But with that being the case, with all of us being at home all day, every day, at a certain point, it became a need for my parents to hire a nanny, a caretaker, to have somebody else in the house to help care for us as we were home all day, every day. In the summer of 1998, shortly before my youngest brother was born, so I'm the oldest, he is number 5 in the family. So we were kind of bunched somewhat together. My parents inquired around town. They found someone who came very highly recommended, and they hired this woman to be our family's caretaker. And about a year later, in September of 1999, just after my 8th birthday, our family's caretaker began sexually abusing me. This was a reality which went on for a very long time. When it happened at first, I did not say anything about it. I did not speak out about it. I really wasn't quite, aware of what was going on to have the ability to speak out about it. And so it continued for a very, very, very long time, almost a decade to be exact. It ended shortly after I turned 18. At that point, most of us were studying in yeshivas and high schools out of state. We weren't all at home. There wasn't that need to have that sort of figure in the house. And so my parents, without really knowing, the backstory or anything that had gone on, parted with this woman on very peaceful, cheerful terms. There was no sort of acrimonious breakup. And everyone kind of went their separate ways. And at that moment, I made a promise to myself that I was really going to continue fulfilling, that I had fulfilled every day of my life till that point. And that was that I was never going to tell a single soul about what had happened. This was going to be the secret, the reality that I was going to take with me to the grave one day. And as far as I was concerned, this was something which obviously bothered me to my core tremendously. It really was on my mind quite a bit, but I had made a pretty firm decision that if I were to not think about it, then these things wouldn't bother me. And the more effort that I would expend not thinking about it, the better off I would be. Funny thing is that a lot of these trauma issues, they don't play by the rules that we would like to enact for them. And notwithstanding the fact that we're not thinking about them, they still find a way to crop up and pop up in our lives. And the trauma that I had suffered continued to bother me on and on continuously. And I would say that it was getting worse instead of getting better. In 2016, shortly after my wife and I had our first child, I was struggling on a variety of levels, on a number of levels. And I'm very fortunate that my wife and my parents were able to notice that, and they sat me down and they told me that they had noticed it wasn't exactly a secret or a mystery that I wasn't myself, and they had no idea what was really going on, but they encouraged me to go and seek out counseling, go and get professional help, just go and talk to somebody and find out why it is that something's not you and what you can do to rectify that. I wasn't very excited about the idea of going to see a therapist, but God bless my wife, who's a very strong Jewish woman. And my mother's a very strong Jewish woman, and they weren't exactly taking no for an answer. And so off I went to counseling to see a therapist. And when I sat in his office for the very first time, he was the first human being that I ever uttered the words to. And I looked up at this gentleman and I said, I think I was sexually abused as a kid. And that began a process of healing, began a lengthy process of healing, which I consider myself blessed and fortunate in every regard to still be involved in now. I'm still regularly involved in counseling and making sure that I can care for myself for the experiences that I have gone through. As part of the conversations that we had in counseling, one of the topics that we covered was the possibility of reporting, going to law enforcement and what that would look like, and all the variety of different factors around that. And I had a number of concerns and anxieties about that, which we'll talk about throughout the evening. Ultimately, though, I did. In 2018, I cold called the Salt Lake City Police Department on one winter morning. I called the non-emergency number and said, "Hi, I'm the victim of a crime. I'm not sure what you folks want me to do with that, but that's my story." And an investigation ensued in March of 2018 on Erev Pesach, literally a few hours before the Seder. My abuser was arrested on suspicion of 130 counts of aggravated sexual abuse of a child. And at that point, the justice system, with all of its characteristics, took over. As she stood trial about a year and a half later, she was found guilty of the 7 felonies that she was charged with. And she's currently doing 25 years to life at the Utah State Prison in Draper. But beyond where she's at, it has given me the ability and the opportunity to be an advocate for this issue in my community, to provide a voice for those that very often, Nick, as you mentioned, don't feel like they have a voice, don't feel like they're understood, don't feel like they have a representative in the world around them. They feel alone, they feel isolated, they feel like no one quite understands their plight. And having that opportunity is the single greatest gift that I think the Almighty God has ever given me, and that really leads us to where we are this evening.
Speaking about God, tell us about the healing process and what role God played for you.
I always love that question, as I think that when people assume that you ask a Chabad rabbi, what was the healing process like, and did God play a role? The expectation is that the answer will be, oh, absolutely. In fact, the healing process was quite easy and painless, because I believe in God, I don't have any issues, and everything just kind of went up in smoke, and it was marvelous and wonderful. And the reality is very much not the case. As I tell people in conversations like these, I think it's fair and accurate to say that the Almighty and I have had a very complicated relationship over the years. And as I like to put it, I really kind of view the phases, I guess you'd say, of the relationship that I have with God in 3 different eras. I spent the majority of my life pretty passionately convinced that the Almighty God hated me. I know that sounds overly simplistic and almost childish. There's a good reason for that. This was a mentality that I developed as a child. When I was 8 years old and these things started happening to me, I didn't really have the vocabulary or the understanding to realize that these things that were being done to me were a crime. They weren't my fault. And as such, if that was the case, if this was the sort of behavior that was being done to me and I wasn't protesting, that made me at least 50% complicit, that I was somehow to blame for all this going on. And that's on me. The blame is on me. The guilt is on me. And so I spent a very, very long time thinking that God hated me. And I got to tell you something, Nick, as one might expect, living in a headspace where you think that God hates you is lonely. It's lonely to feel like the Almighty God has it out for you. When I started therapy, I realized that there was one more painful place, one lonelier place that one could be in, even beyond thinking that God hates you. And that's thinking that God somehow ignored you, missed your file, didn't really care to involve himself in what was going on in your life. And as I began understanding through the process of therapy and counseling that what had happened was a crime, and the various realities that become part of your reality through therapy, that became even more difficult. So I was abused. Someone else did this to me. It's not my fault. It's not my problem. What kind of God allows this to happen to a child? What kind of God sits by idly and watches this happen, not once or twice or 5 times, but dozens and dozens of times during a child's life? I mean, and then you think about the God, not just, God in the abstract, but the God that we learn about and we think about. And frankly, the God that I sell as a rabbi, the God that I almost represent, the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful God. Like, where was he when all this was going on? Was he off that day? Did my plight not make it to his desk? Were there bigger issues that he was dealing with and he just kind of decided to remain oblivious to my suffering? What am I supposed to do with him? Ultimately, those are questions that I will never have a good answer to. And in that sense, I feel welcome to join the legions of human beings that have endured any sort of pain and suffering in their life, that have questions and complaints to God why it was that they had to go through exactly what they went through. But I'll tell you something, Nick, there was another part of my life, another phase of my life, that although it didn't give me the specific answers to these questions, it gave me peace of mind. It gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me something that I could hold on to. And that was after I went public, that I was a survivor of child sexual abuse. And I had the opportunity to use my experiences to enact positive change in my community and the world around me. That gave me the opportunity to realize that maybe, after all, God did have a plan for all of this. And maybe what happened to me happened exactly as he had intended to do, and happened exactly as he was indeed orchestrating all these events from on high, that I could use my pain to find some sense of purpose for other people. Now, why the good that had to happen in this world had to come about as a result of pain and suffering, and why it couldn't happen without that, ultimately is a question, again, that I will never have a satisfactory answer to. But the ability to see how one person's pain can bring about so much positivity in this world, I'd say that has gone a long way towards, I guess, patching up a relationship with God.
Sure. That's, power. What do you think people most misunderstand about the concept of childhood trauma, of abuse? And if you could set the record straight, would you?
I think on a very almost basic level, on the most simplistic level possible, how real it is. I speak to so many young people, and I do think there's a bit of a generational development here. I speak to so many young people who have endured horrible, unspeakable experiences as children, and they struggle as a result of those experiences. They suffer from those experiences. And there are people in their lives who will say to them, why can't you just feel better? Why, what will it take? What will it take for you to be more cheerful? What will it take for you to feel better about these experiences? And I think that what people really need to understand is that mental health is physical health. Mental health is a health issue. Mental health is not a person deciding that they're not cheerful that day, and so they don't want to participate in the day's events because, they didn't get the ball they wanted at recess. Mental health are real health struggles, and the after effects of childhood trauma, or frankly, any trauma in that matter, adult trauma just as well, leaves behind real scarring that requires a lifetime of healing to cope with and to deal with. And those are real medical issues. Those are real tangible issues that need to be treated by a professional, that need to be given the same weight as people would give to physiological issues. And I think it's an issue that the world is improving at as we look at it in the big picture. And people are getting a far better perspective in understanding how all that works. But I think that at its core, that's what it boils down to, is for people to realize that children, young people, old people, any people that have gone through these sorts of traumatic experiences are carrying this with them for the rest of their lives. And that is heavy, that is real, that is intense. And there's a process they need to go through to cope with that and to deal with that.
I think there are a lot of questions that are coming from a practical point. And I'd just like to ask that. I mean, as a rabbi, a parent, a human being, what do you think parents can do to prevent their children from being victims of child sexual predators?
By far my most favorite question that I get in these sorts of talks. And I'll tell you why. I'm on the other side of the fence now. I was abused as a child. I'm now the father of two little boys, 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. The world is opening up before them. And it's personal for me because I need to protect my children just as much as the next fellow. And the best way this question is worded for me at events, and I chuckle every time, parents will come up to me in person or over Zoom, whatever it is, and they'll say, Rabbi, what can I do to guarantee that my child will never cross paths with an adult who seeks to do them harm in any way, shape, or form? And I look at them and I'll say, you want to guarantee that your kid will never cross paths with a predator? There's only one thing you can do. One thing that you can do to absolutely guarantee that your child will not cross paths with someone who wants to do them harm. You know what that is? You got to take them. You have to completely enwrap them in bubble wrap and lock them in a closet in your home. If you do those things, then you can guarantee that your child will never meet a predator outside your home. Short of doing that, there's nothing we can do as parents to guarantee that our children will never cross paths with someone who wants to do them harm. That is far beyond the realm of control that we have as human beings. And it's always fascinating to me. It happened more before I went public when I was sharing this information with people personally. I'll never forget, 2 months before my story came out, there were some family members that I wanted to tell about my experiences privately. I didn't want them to learn about it on the internet. So I have a cousin. He serves as a Chabad rabbi here in the United States on a college campus. And I called him up. We were very close as kids, and I wanted him to hear it from me. And I told him the whole story. And you could hear on the other end of the line, he was very, very distraught. You know, this is a lot for him to handle, as one might expect. And so he hangs up and he calls me back about 15 minutes later and he says, Avremi, I got to tell you, what you shared with me was absolutely just crushed my world. I said, oh, I'm sorry, thank you for sharing that. He says, and I want to tell you something. I talked to my wife and I shared with her what you had shared with me. And we were so distraught what happened to you at the hands of your babysitter. Our kids, we have little kids at home. They have numerous caregivers, who are around the house taking care of them. Because we heard your story, we called them up and we fired them all immediately, sight on scene, because we were so distraught about what your babysitter did to you. And I remember hearing that story in the moment, and I thought the gesture was very touching. The sentiment behind these experiences was profound. But the reality is that for every babysitter that we hear that does this sort of thing, there's also going to be a doctor and a sports coach and a teacher and a member of the clergy and a family member. We can't narrow this sort of behavior to one slice of humanity and say, okay, all predators have this path in life. And so if we make sure our kids don't meet these sorts of people, they'll be fine. We know that not to be true. Mm-hmm. What we can do as parents has very little to do with restricting our children's access to certain types of adults, certain types of human beings. It's all about what we can do as parents. It's all about the environment we can create in our own home. We know that children around the world, across the religious spectrum, regardless of the background in which they grow up, rarely speak to their parents or trusted adults or loved ones about these experiences. The children aren't the ones who speak up. Why is that? Because by and large, it's the children, the boys and the girls, regardless of the identity of the child or the identity of the perpetrator, who carry so much shame for these experiences. And it's their real fear that if they were to say something to a parent or an adult in their immediate circle, they would be the ones who would suffer the consequences because of all the shame they have been made to carry as a result of their experiences. As parents, what we need to do for our children is to share with them the sentiment that there is never any sort of topic, any sort of experience, any sort of encounter that they will ever go through in their lives that will be met by judgmentalism or any sort of shaming on our part as their parents. If they will share something with us, they can come to expect unconditional love, acceptance, and understanding, regardless of what they will share with us. If we want to create an environment where our children will feel safe and protected to speak up about these experiences and make sure it doesn't happen again, it's on us as parents to create that sort of environment, because that sort of environment isn't created on its own. It requires real diligence and hard work and effort on the parents' part to create that sort of dynamic.
Yeah. Rabbi, you're speaking now as a parent, as an adult, with the gift and the value of, sort of an adult's intellect and understanding. What would you say to the little kid, the little 8-year-old inside of you who was abused? What would you tell him now?
I love that question. It's something which I have thought about for years since I started therapy. And I actually consider myself very fortunate that beyond engaging in this sort of activity in a hypothetical sense, I actually had almost such an opportunity. Obviously, I can't time travel, but here in America, as part of our criminal justice proceedings, when someone is found guilty of a crime and they're sentenced, the court provides the opportunity for the victim to address the person who harmed them, or to address the court at sentencing in a kind of limitless manner. Usually when a victim speaks in the courtroom, it's in question and answer format. They're being questioned by their attorney or the other party's attorney. And at sentencing, a victim of a crime has the opportunity to speak unencumbered to the judge, to the person who harmed them, to whomever they like. And so when my abuser was sentenced in March of 2020, I had the opportunity to address her. And as part of my statement in the court that morning, I concluded by reading a letter. It's a letter that I wrote in therapy to that child, to that 8-year-old boy. And ultimately, what I shared with that 8-year-old boy is the resounding theme that it's not your fault. And it sounds, like I said, it sounds very simple. It sounds very basic, but we know that children go through life having been through these experiences for decades, many of them for the entirety of their lives, feeling in their gut that it was their fault. And they can hear that. They can hear it from a lot of people. Oh, it's not your fault. But that's a reality which stays with survivors of childhood sexual violence. They feel it in their bones that it was somehow their fault. And the only thing which I could really do for that child, and really do on a daily basis for that child, address that child that does exist within me, I think on some level, as we can all relate to, that it really was not his fault. It really was not my fault. It really was not the fault of that child. And to provide that reassurance and that comfort and that solace that that child was lacking for such a long time.
We make the decision, you made the decision that it was your fault as an 8-year-old child. And you carry that through then your entire adult life. Mm-hmm. And we live our lives based on the decisions we made as a child, who experiences something that no adult should experience. No adult should have to try and understand and process, yet we have to do that as a child. So studies have shown that sexual predators are often abused themselves as children, but they continue the inexcusable cycle of abusing others. From your perspective, how would you encourage those who have been abused to break the cycle of pain? And is there room for compassion for child sex predators?
I think the more important question is the first one, what we do with that sort of information, because I think that data, that science is overwhelming, in the sense that most people who go on to commit these crimes in many, many instances were victims of these same crimes themselves as children. I think that piece of information should teach us something profound. And that is, it should teach us the urgent need that children who go through these sorts of experiences have to heal properly and adequately from their experiences, because if they don't, they will continue to try and find other ways to numb the pain. And the more options they peruse and the lack of healing they find, the worse they'll go down that rabbit hole of trying to find other ways to medicate. So we know that beyond the fact that sexual predators as adults usually have been through these sorts of experiences as children, we know that, from a strictly data perspective, we know that people who are involved in alcoholism and in drug addiction and all sorts of dangerous behaviors usually carry around some sort of childhood trauma. What does that teach us? That should teach us that people who go through these sorts of experiences spend a lifetime in pain. And they try to do a great many things to alleviate that pain, a variety of things to alleviate that pain. They try to self-medicate. They try to numb that pain. They try to do a great many things to escape feeling that pain. Almost all of the time, they are unsuccessful. Drinking does not numb the pain of childhood trauma. Drugs do not numb the pain of childhood trauma. Dangerous behaviors don't numb the pain of childhood trauma. And by and large, most victims spend a lifetime cycling through a number of things to try and numb the pain. And sadly, for a lot of them, the only thing that they could think of that will somehow take away that endless pain is perpetuating that cycle of violence, is taking away the power from another child, the same way they had that power removed from them as children. This reality should give us such motivation and such encouragement and almost inspiration to people who are survivors of childhood trauma to engage in real healing, because it should show us, it should educate us that if you don't address this properly, it will continue to sit and to fester until something else happens. And so often that something else that will happen is something highly inappropriate, criminal, dangerous, whatever it might be. And so I think that these data points that are readily available should give such encouragement to survivors to get the help that they so desperately need. I think to your second point about, should this give us any sort of room for leniency or for, compassion towards people that have been through this on their own, that then go on to continue the cycle. If you ask me, it really boils down to one criteria, and that is, are they willing to accept that as a reality? If somebody says, yes, I committed this crime because my life has been topsy-turvy since these experiences were part of my own life, and as a result of that, I realize the need that I have to get help, then, sure, that's a mitigating factor. If we just use it as excuses to keep on passing the blame on to the next one and so on and so forth, then I would argue no, because that reality in and of itself is not a reason for leniency. Something bad happened to me doesn't make it entitled for me to then go on and hurt others. Something bad happened to me, I need to address that because I've done negative things as a result of those experiences, and I need to check my own behavior to make sure that doesn't continue. That is a possibility to experience some sort of empathy. But I think that mindset, that perspective is really what it boils down to.
So where one is experiencing pain, you have to make a decision on, I don't want others to experience that pain, as opposed to, well, I'll make myself feel better by, abusing, making others hurt,
Absolutely.
Taking my power from others. So tell us about the work you're currently doing to support victims of abuse, and what role does that play in your recovery, your healing?
I'd say at this point, the work is very multifaceted. And as I mentioned earlier, it's something which I'm tremendously, tremendously grateful for. I think that having been through my experiences, that in and of itself was the single greatest motivator to work in the advocacy space in my community, because for me, the greatest impediment that I had to deal with my issues, to engage in some sort of healing process, was the mentality, the incorrect mentality, that I was the only person in the Chabad world, in the Orthodox world, that had somehow gone through these experiences. And if I were to, speak out about them, I don't know what they would do with me. And having had the ability to learn that's not the case has really been a great motivator to provide that sort of reality for others and to help others in their healing journey. And so there's a lot of one-on-one work. I try to make myself readily available by email, by social media. Survivors reach out in any way, shape, or form, for counseling, for support, for guidance, for understanding, for any sort of advice moving forward. I've had the ability to engage here in town, not so much with the Jewish community per se, but actually on a statewide level, to serve on various boards and councils as a victim of crime, to provide that sort of perspective as government deals with issues and as laws are enacted and as we try to make the world a more just place, especially for children, to share my experiences and see how we can indeed do that. And I think that ties in directly to your second question, Nick. I think any person who has ever healed from anything will tell you that the single greatest thing that you can do to heal is to provide that sort of role for other people. If you want to find compassion in your own soul for yourself, the best way to start that process is to find compassion for others. And I have to say that, giving these talks, working with other survivors, engaging in that sort of advocacy work is the single greatest healer, is the single greatest tool that I think any human being can tap into to really have the ability to move on from their own traumas, to move on from their own experiences, to find a world where people can find help, people can find that sort of safe and welcoming environment, and it does as much for you as it does for them, if not more.
Absolutely. I think we grow what we have in terms of the quality of our life by giving it away and by dealing with others. Now, Rabbi, I wanted to go back to an earlier point and just ask, you spoke about in another interview just that you got on with your life. We spoke about how people deal with, for me, I started drinking at the age of 9 at a Pesach. I was hiding wine in my soup, so I know, I'm an alcoholic.
Creative.
So,
that is.
Yeah, absolutely. It was love at first sight. Wine in my pea soup. It was a wonderful thing. And that's how I started to deal with what I had to deal with. There's no class in junior school that teaches you when you've suffered this is what you do. And you spoke about you studied, you got your grades, you moved on. Where did you find the strength and the ability to do that while you have all this internal turmoil?
I think that is such a powerful question, Nick, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I think it speaks to the single greatest misconception that people have about survivors of childhood trauma. And you asked earlier about setting the record straight on a number of topics. This is something that I'm very, very passionate about. Right after I went to the police, there were a few people I needed to tell. Before it was public knowledge, there were people that I felt that I had been lying to for a very long time by not being honest with them who I really was, and I needed to tell them. One of them was a mentor of mine in yeshiva, was a teacher of mine in yeshiva who I had been exceptionally close with, and I needed to set the record straight. He was probably the person I had come as close as possible to, spilling the beans, and I hadn't done it, and I needed to come clean. So I called him up one evening, and it just all tumbled out, and I told him everything there was to say, and it's quiet on the other end of the line for a good 30 seconds. This is someone who in his lifetime has educated, at this point, probably close to thousands of young men in yeshiva, certainly hundreds. It's quiet, and he says, wow, this was not what the conversation that I expected to have with you. And the sentiment behind the comment was, sure, he's likely dealt with young men who are survivors of childhood trauma. Usually, he has this sort of conversation around behavioral failings. Why are you drinking so much? Why are you sleeping in the mornings? Why aren't you a functioning human being? Oh, because I'm a survivor of childhood trauma. Oh, you are? Okay, we can find empathy for you. But to have the conversation with someone who has been successful during their academic career, that was an experience he had never had yet. And so I appreciated the sentiment. As I understand it, I think he was trying to convey a compliment of sorts. Wow, you were successful, notwithstanding that. I don't know how that works. For me, that is the single greatest challenge that we need to overcome in our society. To assume that everyone who has been through trauma is cast to the side of the road. Because I think that what that does, what that mentality does, is it prevents people from coming forward because they're concerned, who am I going to be lumped in with? If I say that this is my experience, if I say that this is my life, they're going to think that I'm also a crazy person. Like, the only people that I know that have spoken out about this are the people who have been struggling. And so if I don't want to share with people that I'm perhaps an alcoholic, or that I'm, doing drugs, or that I'm doing whatever it is, why would I speak out about this? I coped with my pain by drowning my pain in my religious experience. I coped with my pain by drowning my pain in my academics. You tried to drown your pain, Nick, in wine-infused pea soup. I tried to drown my pain in Talmud. And I'll tell you this, you can't drown your pain in pea soup. You also cannot drown your pain in Talmud. You can study pages upon pages upon pages of Talmud. It won't make you feel better. For me, succeeding academically, being, a successful yeshiva student was the path that I went down to make sure that nobody would know what was really going on under the surface. And if I was to learn, 2 more tractates of Talmud, or 1 more, 600-page book of Hasidic thought, I'd be good to go. That is as unhealthy as alcoholism. It is as damaging as alcoholism. And so for me, it wasn't so much about finding strength. It was about finding an alternative coping method. Some people drink, some people study. They're both equally wrong in the sense that neither one of those is actually engaging in any sort of healing or wellness-centered behavior.
So when it dominates every aspect of your being, where there isn't time to be still, to sit quiet, because if we stop moving, those thoughts and those feelings and that trauma comes back up. How did we spoke about the conversation with the little 8-year-old you. How did you move on from those beliefs that you set? The topic of the talk, which I absolutely love it, is moving from surviving to thriving. I think that is an incredibly wonderful gift to give people, particularly at this time. So how did you move from surviving to thriving?
I'll tell you this, Nick. I very much like the title of the talk. It works from a literary perspective and all that. The first time there was a Chabad community that used that name for the talk, there's a group chat that I have with a number of other survivors, men and women. And I shared with them the flyer, the marketing for the event. And I said, look, guys, I've officially been cleared. I have moved on from my struggles, and now I'm officially thriving. And I think if you look at later on in the brochure, it says I've become a successful father, parent, and something else.
Rabbi.
Rabbi, yeah. I have become a rabbi, so that is true. The reality is, this is a lifetime journey. Mm-hmm. Healing from that mindset, healing from that perspective of that 8-year-old, you don't get a degree in completing it. You don't get a certificate at the end of 90 days or 3 years or whatever it is. It says, congratulations, you have now matriculated from your childhood trauma. Go forth, thrive, move into your adult life, and you'll never be bothered by these issues again. I'm afraid it's not the case. I share often the conversation that I had with my therapist after the first time that we talked. I had shared with him when I showed up in his office that I wasn't very excited about being there. And I told him, I've been pushed to come here, and we started having this conversation. And I had to say, the hour passed rather quickly, and it was almost somewhat enjoyable. And so we finished our conversation, and we were both being very candid with each other. And I looked up at him and I said, okay, this wasn't as bad as I expected. I'm going to be honest with you. This wasn't as painful as I had anticipated. So let me ask you this, doctor. How many more times do you plan on seeing me? The question that I wasn't putting into words, what I was hoping he would read between the lines, a couple of years before I went to therapy, I broke my leg. I had to have surgery. I went to see my orthopedist. He patched me up good as new. I went to physical therapy for about, 6 to 8 weeks. And then I was done. I was sent off back into the world, a fixed man. And, I love my doctor. I love my physical therapist. I have no intention of engaging in a lifelong relationship with them. I saw them once, twice, a dozen times, and off we go. And so what I was saying to the therapist was, okay, so this was cool. What now? Like, am I going to see you for 3-4 months? Are you going to give me a book to read, maybe some medication? And then at what point do you give me the note that says, Avremi is fixed. Send him out there. He's good to go. And he looked up at me and he says, I'll tell you what, why don't you come back next week and we'll take it from there. And we joke about that because, I still see him. I'm very fortunate to have been able to stick with the same man now for 5.5 years. And at the end of every session, I say, you know what? Why don't I come back? And now we're every other week. Why don't I come back in 2 weeks and we'll take it from there? Because the message that he was conveying is that's not quite how it works. No one graduates from childhood trauma. You mentioned earlier, Nick, that there's no class in junior school what to do if you've been a survivor of childhood trauma. Well, there's no degree at the end of that class. So there's certainly no class and there's certainly no degree. You move on from this. You graduate. You're good to go. Go back into the world out there. You deal with it every single day. Every single day you wake up with the mentality that today I have the ability to fight for myself. Today I have the ability to focus on being a victim of my pain or a survivor of someone who's come out through the other side. And that is a choice that I make every single day. Every single day I need to represent that 8-year-old child. Every single day I need to make choices in the spirit of healing and growing and moving forward. And there are days that I'm more successful at that, and there are days that I'm less successful at that. But that needs to absolutely be a daily journey every single day.
What I would like to ask you, and just before we go to questions, because I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. You spoke about fighting for yourself and the daily journey. You said in other interviews where you walked into your therapist's office and they said to you, he said to you, why are you here? And you said, and this had a very, very strong, profound effect on me. I think I'm the victim of childhood sexual abuse. That takes tremendous courage because you're putting it out there into the world and effectively to a stranger. What was the decision that you made to say that, to start that process, to understand you had to say it before you can move on?
I think it was a reality check that I was resistant to going to therapy. I wasn't ignorant to the fact that I was deeply, deeply struggling. And it's a point that I draw on very often when I speak now to parents of young people, teens, young adults, some adolescents, who will say to me, my child has been through hell and back. They've gone through horrible, horrible experiences. We need to get them help. They are resistant to getting help. What should we do? I always tell parents in every instance, no one has ever healed against their will. No one has ever been dragged kicking and screaming to a doctor's office, to a therapist's office, to a treatment facility, and been able to properly and adequately heal if they go in that mindset. You need to create the environment. You need to sow the seeds to allow the growth to happen. Every single person who has been through these sorts of experiences knows they need to take a step out of that world. All they're waiting for is the correct environment and the correct surrounding support to make that decision feasible and possible. If you know someone who has been through these sorts of experiences, there will come a day when they will speak out about it to a doctor, to a parent, to a loved one, to a stranger. There will come a day. All we can do is create the environment to allow that to happen. And so for me, walking into that therapist's office, realizing, look, this is probably going to be my best chance to ever move on from that. And in a certain sense, Nick, you mentioned it was a stranger. It was easier to have the conversation with a stranger than it was per se with a parent. But I tell this to parents so often, there will always come a day when they will feel comfortable to come out. You cannot force the issue. You can somehow speed up the process by creating that environment, but that's all we can really do. It needs to come from the survivor themselves.
Absolutely. I see this all the time at the treatment centers that I work at, where people are brought there against their will and it doesn't work. We have to want to be able to move on and heal. I think if we move into the questions and people can just post their question, I'll ask it anonymously in the comments. And the first one I'd like to ask is, and it's a huge point, this, because it's how did your parents react? And I think a lot of victims, we're terrified of discussing this with our parents because we don't want to cause them pain. We don't want to bring our pain to them. That, you know, they weren't responsible or they were unaware, whatever the reason is. How did your folks react?
So let me tell you this. I made a very conscious decision that I was not going to share with my parents what had happened until I could come to a place where I could have the conversation with them and I could honestly and authentically communicate with them that I didn't think that what had happened was their fault. And therapy was very helpful for that in the beginning, because really understanding the dynamic of how these sorts of things happen and why these sorts of things happen gave me very early on the ability to understand that. So I waited a couple weeks till I really had that vocabulary and I had that understanding. And I sat down with my parents and I said, you know, I want you to know that this is what happened and I want you to absolutely hear it from me. I do not believe any of this is your fault. And I do not believe there's anything that you could have done or not done that would have prevented this from happening or changed these experiences in any way. And I really wanted my parents not to feel guilty. That was the stated intention. The funny thing about guilt, as I'm sure we can all relate to on a certain level, first of all, as humans, second of all, particularly as Jews, guilt has a way of popping up in situations even when we don't intend for it to pop up. Guilt is a super rational emotion. My parents do feel guilty because of what happened. And in a certain sense, I think it's been the greatest education for me is that when one person goes through these sorts of experiences, there is a healing process that needs to happen for everybody in their circle. Everyone that's immediately surrounding them needs to heal from these experiences. And for my parents, dealing with the guilt that stems from these sorts of experiences is a process unto itself. They need to figure out what that means for them, how they cope with those very intense emotions. And for the other people that were involved in the story, it means something else. And so it was my intention. It is my intention for them not to feel guilty at times. Notwithstanding my very noble intentions, they still feel guilty. And that is my journey and that is their journey. And it's one that will probably continue going down for a very long time.
Thank you. Another question, what made you decide to open a criminal case against your abuser? I mean, that's going to bring up a lot of feelings. It's going to publicize it. And, you know, you're going to Navy SEAL boot camp in terms of publicity. So what was the decision?
I think it's probably one of the more misunderstood parts of my story. A lot of people think that, you know, I'm a very vengeful person based on those experiences. And I encourage everyone to, you know, call for people's heads and to be, you know, bloodthirsty in these matters. Very much not the case. Very, very much not the case. I wanted acknowledgement on the part of my abuser. I wanted the person who did this to me to realize the pain that she had put me through and to own up to that and to take steps to correct that. So I filed a police report just to kind of see what that process would look like. And I was very content for the police to go to her and say, you know, these allegations have been brought up. Do you have a comment? And you know, and for her to say, you know, yes, I did these things. How can I make up for these things? How can I make restitution? How can I correct my mistakes? She didn't. And the only recourse that was available was to pursue criminal proceedings and to take it to trial. And there were multiple points along the process where deals were offered and settlements were offered. And there was this repeated effort on the prosecution's part at my urging that, you know, this doesn't need to become bigger than it is. Just realize the depth of what you've done and we can all kind of grow from that. And there was resistance to that. And so as such, we took really the only recourse that we had, which was a trial. But for me, it came from a deep yearning for there to be an acknowledgement, some form of ownership, which there wasn't. And as a result of that, we took the steps that we needed to. But I think that mostly survivors are looking to be heard more than they're looking for lengthy jail sentences.
Absolutely. What would you, I love this question. What would you say is your biggest bracha, your biggest blessing out of this trauma?
Without question, that I have the unique ability to make a difference in my community in a way that otherwise would not have been possible. You know,
in the world. I mean,
in the world, yeah. Well, yeah. It started with my community, and eventually it's branched out into the world. You know, very often, I always. A lot of the events with the police happened around Purim, and so I always share this anecdote. That year I was reading the Megillah, and I remember reading, I'm the Balkaira here in Shul, and I remember reading the back and forth, the dialogue between Mordechai and Esther. After Haman's decree comes out and Esther finds out that Mordechai is sitting in the center of town and he's wearing sackcloth and ashes, and she's deeply concerned, and she says to him, what's going on? And he says, no, Esther, you got to go to the king. We have this huge problem on our hands. And Esther says, I appreciate the urgency of the situation, but I cannot go to the king. I haven't been summoned. It's not an option. And it's interesting, when Mordechai responds to Esther, he doesn't rationalize with her. And he doesn't try to convince her why it is an option, why perhaps she should reconsider her position. What does Mordechai say to Esther? Did you ever consider that this is why you became queen? I'm not telling you that the road ahead is not daunting and it's frankly dangerous and you may have to risk your life to make this decision. But did you ever stop to consider for a moment, this is exactly the reason why your soul came down into this world. This is the moment for you to make a difference that nobody else in the world can. And I think about that dialogue quite a bit. Is this journey easy necessarily? No. Is it pleasant at times? Certainly not. But it's mine. And at times I have to realize to myself that this is the specific reason why the Almighty God put my soul into this world, was to make this sort of unique difference. And I think for a person to be in a position to realize that ability, that is the single greatest bracha that a person can ever ask for.
Sure, absolutely. Power of, wow. Love it. I was going to say the question had to be from a Chabadnik, obviously, because it's the good. Yeah. We got time, one last question, and then I'll hand back to Shlomo. And there are quite a few questions still, so we'll see if we can perhaps find.
First, we have, from my perspective, we have the ability to go a little bit over time, but I do want to put out there, if people want to reach out, Shlomo has my email address. They're welcome to reach out on social media. I'm on a variety of platforms at Utah Rabbi, UTAH RABBI. I get that in a conversation like this, there are oftentimes the desire to continue the conversation in a more private forum. And so if people want to reach out independently, Reb Shlomo has my email address. People are welcome to reach out in any shape or form, and they're absolutely welcome to do so. And we even have the ability to go 5-10 minutes over time if that's what the
Fantastic.
situation is.
All right, good. We've got about 4 or 5 more questions. This one is a little bit tough, and I'm going to add something to it as well. It says, when or how will you tell your children? And I would add to that, will you?
So will you? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I believe in that very profoundly, because I believe that the greatest way to arm our children against this, God forbid, happening to them is to be honest with them, that this sort of thing happens. It happens in our families. It happens in our communities. And they are not immune from these sorts of experiences because they grow up in a Chabad family. I have a 6-year-old who knows how to read. He's like at that phase right now where, like, we're driving on the highway and he'll start reading words off billboards and I'll be like, who taught you how to, wow, okay, I guess you read. And so there is actually someone printed up for me, the clippings of the news story when it originally came out, and it's on a plaque in my office. And I venture to say that in the next probably few months, weeks, he'll walk in and he'll start reading words off that board, and he'll want to know what exactly it says. He knows, he was 4 when the trial happened. He knows that there was a time when I was going to court every day and it was weighing very heavily on me. He doesn't yet know the specifics, but I firmly believe that I will share with him in an age-appropriate manner everything that he wants to know. I will not sugarcoat it. I will not be dishonest with him. I believe that as a parent, we have the opportunity to share with our child that there is some sort of sensitive information that they will understand differently at a later point in time, but never to give our children half-truths, never to somehow, give them disillusionment about a certain reality. I will tell it to him like it is, because I believe giving him that honesty is the single greatest tool that I have to prevent that from ever happening to him.
And that leads us into the next question. How would you make people like parents or older siblings aware of what's happening, the situation that you experienced? How would you advise someone, God forbid, who's going through that now to talk or to share?
I advise people very often when they are in the process of wanting to disclose to try it out in small doses. I encourage people to consider a circle around them. They're in the middle of the circle, and to add one person to the circle. Find one person whom they deeply trust, and to go through the experience of sharing that information to get real life experience as to how the reaction will go. I think we have become so programmed to expect that if we share the sort of information, it will be treated with a certain reaction, that we don't give ourselves the opportunity to actually try it out. We so anticipate being called a liar, not being believed, not being trusted, and so on and so forth. And so I so deeply encourage people, find one person and share it with them and see how that goes, and try that on for yourself. And if that was a positive experience, find one more person and one more person. And I encourage people to tell their families. I encourage people to be honest with their families. And I'll share this powerful anecdote. So often I'll hear from survivors, I want to tell person X, but I don't want this issue to affect them. And if I tell them this, then it will start affecting them. And I think it's such a powerful misconception about this topic. If there is a person in your life that you are close with, and this is your reality, you are a trauma survivor, whatever else, everyone in your life has been affected by your experiences, whether you have told this to them or not. Just the proximity that they have to your life means they have been touched by these experiences. By sharing this information with them, you are not somehow creating the reality. You are giving them context that has been so sorely lacking for the years they have known you until now. So by sharing this information, we're not somehow putting people at a disservice or disadvantaging them. We are giving them the knowledge and the context and the education they need to grow through this with us. And so I encourage disclosures to family in the most healthy and appropriate ways possible, but I believe it to be the only way that everyone can heal.
Thank you. I think if we have time just for one or two more questions.
Please.
The gentleman put his name down, so there's a question from Jeff. Rabbi, would you ever forgive your abuser?
Thank you, Jeff. Not only would I actually have. I mentioned earlier I had the opportunity to read a statement in court, and on the day that my abuser was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, I consider myself blessed that I had the opportunity to look at her in the courtroom and to tell her to her face that I forgave her. And I made it abundantly clear that to that moment, she had never asked for forgiveness or accepted any sort of guilt or responsibility for what she had done. But notwithstanding that, I made the decision to forgive her. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that I think we don't realize that forgiveness is a lot more powerful for the person giving the forgiveness than the person receiving the forgiveness. If I made the decision to wake up every single day for the rest of my life feeling resentful towards the person who hurt me, I don't think there's a soul on this earth that would tell me that I was not entitled to that. I feel like I'm entitled to my resentment from now until all time. These things happened and I have the right to be resentful. Here's the problem. If I spend my entire day feeling negative and angry and hateful and spiteful and resentful towards that person, the person who's the subject of all my resentment, she doesn't feel any of those negative emotions that are bubbling up inside me. The only person who does is me. I have to live with that every single day for the rest of my life. And so I made the decision that I am on a diet of cutting myself off toxic behavior, and I'm cutting resentment out of my life. And I looked her in the eye and I said, I'm moving on from you. I'm making the decision not to wake up every morning resentful and angry and spiteful towards you, because when I do that, I get harmed, not you. And so I'm cutting myself off those behaviors because it's not in my best interest. It's not something which I want to engage in. And so I've decided to move on from that.
Fantastic. I heard a wonderful analogy once that resentment is drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick.
Yeah, I heard about a burning coal, but yeah, at the same point, I agree with that.
Okay. So one last question, and we've probably answered it, but do you feel overprotective towards your own children? Can Jewish parents feel overprotective?
I think from a scientific standpoint, that's impossible. But I'll tell you, going back to the point I made earlier, I don't. I feel like I don't. Maybe my kids feel like I do. Maybe one day in 20 years from now, they'll tell me that I was an overprotective parent. It's probably going to happen. It's how the world evolves. I don't. In fact, I hire babysitters for my children. Mm-hmm. And I don't install nanny cams in every room of the house, and I don't hover around them perpetually. These are people that I trust, and beyond the trust that I have in the people that I hire in my home, I trust my children. I work every day at creating a relationship with my children where if there was something going on in their life, they would feel comfortable and safe to bring that up to me. And so I trust God on a certain level. I know that's not always totally sufficient. I trust the people that I hire. I trust my kids to fight for themselves, to represent themselves, and to speak out if something, God forbid, were to happen. And ultimately, that's all we can do as parents, as human beings, as individuals, is place our faith, place our trust in the powers that be, create the kalim, as we often talk about in Hasidic thought, create the vessels in the life that we can to allow what we need to happen. And beyond that, that's if we live with that fear and then anxiety forever, as we talked about with resentment, Nick, it only stands to bug us more than it stands to bug anybody else.
And it affects them because, as you said, those around the victim of the abuse feel their pain in some way or another. Thank you so much. If I could hand back to Shlomo to jump in. Should we unmute him?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Rabbi Asher Darren from the West Coast to conclude.
Thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Weiner, for facilitating this very, very important evening and meaningful talk with Avremi, with Rabbi Zippel. And to you, Rabbi Zippel, I just want to say, I wrote to my community on Friday that I have such fond memories of being with you in camp, where you were always the most normal camper, just fun and full of confidence and spunk and talent and, public speaking and all of that. And when I first heard the news, when I saw it on social media that you had come out with this story, you had gone public with the abuse you had endured, it shocked me because you broke every stereotype I had of what a victim is supposed to look like, as you mentioned. And I think both through following your story over the years and from listening to you tonight, you've taught me a lot about how to protect my children, how to see people in my community, and to realize that it could be anywhere. And we need to make sure that we're providing the support and the care. And I just want to thank you for making yourself so vulnerable to all of us here in South Africa and the world. I think you really made an impact on the world at large. And please God, we hope for the day very soon when all of your work will become redundant. But until such time, we are all in your gratitude and hope for, please God, continued success in Nachas from your Kinderlach and from all of the Kinderlach around the world for whom you're creating a better world. Thank you.
So thank you, Rov. Rabbi Zippel, I just wanted to say it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to share with you as well. We've had well over 200 people viewing this, and it goes to show we don't always choose. We don't always get to choose what we experience, but we get to choose what we do with that experience. And we are very grateful for your courage and your honesty and the gentleness with which you shared your experience. And for those that are struggling or know of someone that is in pain, they can contact Rabbi Zippel. Your email address is up on the chat thread, or just get in touch with your community rabbi, with your local Chabad. And then also just in South Africa, this is the right one, also Kolenu, so just to put up their number. And I had it here a minute ago, Rolf, but this always happens. So, Rolf, is there anything that you would like to add in closing?
I have to say, I appreciate the hospitality, the South African legendary hospitality, but I appreciate the effort that everyone made to come out this evening. I think being part of the conversation is in and of itself a tremendous burden that people feel the need to step up and shoulder, to be open to having these conversations and engaging in these sorts of discussions to protect their families. And as I think Rabbi Darren put it best, I look forward to the day when all of this good work will be absolutely unnecessary. May that indeed happen very, very speedily in our days.
Please God, please God. I just wanted to, Kolenu is also a local, it's a South African community support network for abuse victims. So that's their number, 011-264-0341, or your local Chabad Rov or Rabbi. Rabbi Zippel, thank you.
Thank you
so much. All right.